If we see basis improving in Nebraska, I think that's going to tell us that, yeah, these projects work. Hello, I'm Matthew Kruse at CommStock Investments. I want to talk a bit about the growth that we're seeing in corn ethanol production in Brazil. Before I do that, I'm going to point out a few things that we're seeing with weather. You probably have heard by now over the weekend, there were some areas of frost that were reported in kind of isolated areas up in North Dakota, maybe in northern Minnesota. I guess we're waiting to hear back what the impact on that has had. It didn't last very long. And some of the earlier in the week, last week, it didn't really see the temperatures were going to dip down that low. So the market doesn't seem to think much of it right now. It's kind of trading up at the moment, but time will tell. But looking out at temperatures, things are going to start to warm back up again this week, as you can kind of see here. They're going in the other direction where we're consistently 4 to 6, some areas up to 7 degrees above average for this week of September out through September 18th. And so we're going from one extreme to the other, it looks like, but there's still a lot of areas that are going to get scattered showers. There's parts in Indiana, Ohio that looks like later into next week we'll probably see some more rain, but I don't know how much good it's going to do at that point. I don't think it's going to do hardly any good for the corn and probably not much, if anything, for the soybeans. But there is still rainfall ahead for a lot of areas in South Dakota, Nebraska. Still see a lot of rainfall here this part of mid-September. Looking out in Brazil, they have officially started their soybean crop planting for the 25-26 season. Reports of some soybeans are already rolling in the state of Paraná. It looks like there's not much rain in those areas yet. You're not going to see much progress, and nor will you see much in Mato Grosso. But this is the rainfall looking out through September 23rd. And it does begin to pick up here the closer we get to the end of September. And so I think as time goes on, you're going to see those pick up. But the bulk of the crop in Mato Grosso usually goes into the month of October. So it's still very early, but you will, as the rainfall picks up, you're going to see reports of farmers beginning to kind of start going. But the first crop corn is already well underway. As much about a third of the first crop corn has been planted. And the bulk of that is in Rio Grande do Sul, which is the southernmost state here in the south, and other areas in Paraná. Minas Gerais is also a large producer of first crop corn, but the bulk of it is going in Rio Grande do Sul right now. And so long ways to go there. Yeah, it's still very early, but just wanted to point that out. What I wanted to talk to you about this morning is a lot of the growth that we've talked about a lot in the past for corn ethanol explosion, what that means in Brazil. The United States went through its major corn ethanol development in the early 2000s. And by comparison, Brazil is kind of going through that same period now. It's probably not growing quite as fast, but it is growing at a steady pace. Whereas corn ethanol made up almost virtually non-existent 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And now it's already makes up about 20% of Brazil's ethanol production, the other 80% being produced by sugarcane. And so there's currently about 21 ethanol plants in Brazil that are producing corn ethanol. Roughly half of those are exclusive to pure corn ethanol plants, and the other half are flex plants, meaning they produce ethanol from sugarcane half of the year, and then they switch back to corn the other half. And you're seeing really more of an increase in pure corn ethanol plants where they're processing corn around the year, 12 months out of the year. There are reported 22 additional ethanol plants that are either in construction or have been announced and are expected to come online. I think roughly 5 to 6 of those are expected to come online here in the next 12 months. It can take 2 years or more to build an ethanol plant. And so you kind of see here where those ethanol plants are being announced. And of course, the majority of them are in the center west region here in these states of Mato Grosso do Sul, and Goiás. They are announcing them in other areas too that are strong in grain crop production or corn production as well. And they're also announcing some wheat ethanol project in Rio Grande do Sul, where the vast majority of wheat is produced in the southernmost state there in the south. These additional plants would make up about 1.3 billion gallons and take them from about 2.2 billion gallons of production today up to about 3.5 billion gallons of production here in the next couple of years. You compare that to U.S. production, which is over 15 billion gallons. You might think, well, that's not very much. But considering that 8 years ago, it was almost at zero. And so they're growing this from 0 to 3.5 billion gallons of corn ethanol in a 10-year period. Pretty steady growth, and we think that that will continue. What's unusual is that we're seeing these ethanol plant announcements on almost a monthly basis, where every month some new group or new investment, new co-op is building a new ethanol plant someplace. And so it's become very popular, and I think you're going to continue to see that. Now, I will mention that just because somebody announces a project doesn't mean that it's happening, right? That you still got to get the funding together, and it takes secure the location, secure the feedstock, and the total number of plants that are announced doesn't equal what are actually built. And we saw that same thing in the United States. I think at one point there was as many as 600 ethanol plants that were announced, and ultimately only like 200 got built. And so that's kind of the same thing. But the biggest challenge to building these plants, or the greatest bottleneck, I should say, is the power to run the plants. Where in the United States, most ethanol plants are connected to a natural gas pipeline. Well, in Brazil, they don't have natural gas, at least not in these frontier regions and these corn production regions where they're installing these plants. And so a lot of them are run off of eucalyptus wood chips, which is essentially a renewable source of power. And I know one of the largest ethanol plants there, the FS ethanol plant invested by the Summit Ag Group, they own roughly 200,000 acres of eucalyptus forests. And it basically gives them an annual supply to run all of their plants. And so it's a huge investment, obviously, to source that land and manage that as well. But it does give them one tremendous advantage, that it reduces their carbon footprint by quite a bit. Where in the United States, the average ethanol plant might have a carbon score of over 50. Whereas right now, a lot of those ethanol plants that are using renewable wood chips as their fuel source, their carbon score is closer to 17. Another thing that made news here is that they've recently announced that they're going to begin selling carbon credits for those ethanol plants for about $150 per ton of carbon. And to do that, though, they have to begin sequestering or burying that carbon in the soil. And so they've announced plans to do this by, or at least begin construction here in the summer of 2026. And this gives the ethanol plants a pretty large competitive advantage, I see, because it opens up global markets to them that are otherwise shut off from the U.S. market. So places like Europe, places like California that are willing to pay a premium for what they deem as more environmentally friendly biofuels are going to look to source their biofuel production from places like this. This is kind of frustrating, because what this basically means is that ethanol buyers in California might be more interested in buying their ethanol in the future from places like this in Brazil versus the ethanol plant that's in my backyard in Northwest Iowa. This kind of gives you a projection of the growth that has been taking place in the corn ethanol in Brazil. You kind of see it's been growing steadily, still has a long way to go, but the point is that it's every year they're looking to increase the capacity, and this is kind of the expectation that they're going to hit 3.5 billion gallons in the next couple of years. They're already at 2.2 billion gallons. And so it's been growing steadily, and it makes sense as corn is their biggest cost, their feedstock, so to say, and it's some of the cheapest corn in the world is in Mato Grosso. And so, rather than export that grain out, they're processing it there and adding value to it in ethanol, which Brazil is a very large producer and consumer of ethanol. Now, one of the short-term positives that I see from this is that it's possible that more of the domestic corn production will get consumed internally, consumed domestically rather than go for export. And so you can see here 40% of Brazil's corn goes to export. And they've obviously grown tremendously as a potential competitor with the United States corn export market, taking more of our market share as they have with the soybeans. Their industry right now, which is a big part of that, is the corn ethanol, represents 14%. So it makes sense that as the corn ethanol expands in Brazil, that they're going to export less, assuming they're producing the same amount. So short term, I can see that taking away more of their exports and competing with us less. Now, longer term, as they make progress and they are expanding and adding more corn ethanol plants, they may, of course, look to increase their production as we did in the United States. And so, but short term, it might produce a little bit of a net positive. But long term, as long as it's working out for them, they're going to want to produce more corn. And adversely, they may look to begin exporting more ethanol. And so, frankly, that's kind of been one of the biggest growth areas where we've struggled. We can't get E15 year round. And so we're struggling to kind of expand our domestic market for ethanol. And so the thing that's really been the growth area for the ethanol industry as a whole has been the exports. And so, frankly, as long as we have a higher carbon score, I don't see our U.S. ethanol being as competitive as Brazilian ethanol because of the things that I talked about that they're doing, that they're sequestering the carbon. And so, well, this is a point of concern for me because, I can see that their ethanol becoming more competitive on the export market, but all that can go away if we were to get our carbon pipeline established and get them connected to U.S. ethanol plants here in the United States. I know some of those pipeline projects seem to be paused right now or stalled, and I know there's one in Nebraska that is moving forward. And so I think we need to look at that project pretty closely. They're supposedly building these pipelines in Nebraska and going to sequester that carbon in Wyoming. And so I'm very interested to see what the results of that are. If we see basis improving in Nebraska, I think that's going to tell us that, yeah, these projects work and make sense and will make more money for farmers. I'd like to see more progress being made on the Summit pipeline, but that's kind of been stalled and blocked in South Dakota. But I guess the point of this is that Brazil is developing their carbon programs in conjunction with their ethanol production in Brazil. It's something that's growing, it's something that's happening now. And my concern is that we are going to become less competitive if we don't do some of the same things because they're currently doing it now. That's what I have for you today. If you have any questions about the Brazil corn ethanol demand and going forward, feel free to reach out. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.